Story number 1. I did not go to the forest to learn its secrets. I went to count trees and found a field of mouths instead. I did not set out to remember the dead. The plain pressed their names into me like thorns under skin. I was looking for trails left by men. I found the straightest trail of all, a line drawn from sky to earth. The day began with maps and ended with prayers whispered to soil heavy with bone. If I raise my eyes at night, I still feel the air moving past me, as if the sky itself were a river and I am sinking through it. My name is Dr. Fernando Castillo. And the first truth I will confess is that duty can lead a person into places where language fails. I had spent most of my adult life measuring distances with a steel tape and a battered compass, writing down coordinates in a tiny, rain-warped notebook, while the heat was a hand on the back of my neck. For 17 years, I worked for the National Parks Administration here in Argentina. The job taught me the slow grammar of dry winds and thorn shadows, the way lowland trees lean toward the scantest promise of water. It taught me something else as well. When a landscape is hurt long enough, it learns how to keep quiet. Gran Chaco, a name that tastes like dust and sap, was my classroom. I was posted all over the country, but most of my time was spent in a place known as Gran Choco. Call it a plain, call it a mosaic of low forests and shivering grass, call it a threshold between nations. Either way, it is a country that begins again every morning, a rough page rewritten by hoof and fire. It's a mix of savas and thorn scrub, but also subtropical forests, palm groves, and wetlands stitched together by heat and the patient stitchwork of roots. Beauty lives there, but beauty is not the same as mercy. By the early 1990s, the plain had learned a new alphabet. Tire tracks burned into clearings, tree stumps reading like punctuation marks after sentences someone had torn in half. Since the 1970s, the region has been plagued by illegal logging and forest fires set by cattle ranchers who wanted the sky to be larger for their herds. When patrols were short-handed, I went alone. And when I went alone, I told myself that work was work, and fear was a rumor I would not dignify with a map symbol. The late summer sun that year had the color of old brass. I moved north from Fuerte Esperanza, the ATV shuddering over ruts, until the scrub gave way to a stand of algarobo and pink trumpet trees, immaculate enough to calm my chest. The algarobo are particularly favorites of illegal loggers, so I wanted to make sure that this forest was untouched by their hands. I drifted between trunks, marking notes, tracing a lazy rectangle on my map. Nothing was wrong. That was precisely the warning. On the way back, the ground remembered to be treacherous. Roots wove themselves like cables beneath a knee-high mat of grass. And my stride, content in its own thoughtlessness, was given a lesson. Most of the time, I merely stumble when catching my foot on something, but on this occasion, I caught my foot immediately after hopping over a thick branch I had seen without understanding. I tipped forward, arms out, and the earth rose to meet me with a brittle complaint. I felt the difference at once. Notice how I described it as a crunch, not a thud, because I didn't fall directly into the dirt and grass. The forest floor did not receive me. Something beneath it intercepted my weight with the fragile authority of a dried leaf. I rolled, swore under my breath, and after picking myself up, I saw that I hadn't landed on a pile of fallen branches. I'd landed almost directly on a pile of bones. The first thought was reflex. Jaguar cache. The plain has its rulers and its accountants, and a big cat is both. Since jaguars are very active in Gran Choco, I initially thought that the bones must have belonged to a jaguar kill, perhaps a deer or some type of pig. But the lengths were wrong. The arcs too human in their intent. Upon further inspection, I found that they were too large to be a pig of any kind, and too much like a monkey to be a deer. My denial went hunting for a monkey until I saw the skull, and there was no mistaking things anymore. Wind threaded the long grass beside me, and I realized my own breath had become a stranger. There is a courtesy the living owe the dead, to understand that we are the visitors. A powerful feeling of mortal dread came over me. I stepped back, crossed myself, then did the practical things. I cleared grass with my boot. I looked for the ways a person might have come to rest here. A fall, a ditch, a crime that wore itself out and sank. What I found, instead, was not an event, but a pattern, which is the cruelest kind of discovery. A second set of bones lay so near the first that the two were cousins. Then a third, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. The field was no longer a field, but a jawbone, and I was walking along its teeth. I came to realize that there were human remains for 100 meters in every direction. Boots slumped like abandoned thoughts beside the limb bones. A shattered sneaker cupped a seedling that had decided to trust the world again. Every couple of meters, I saw the eyeless sockets of a skull as they stared back at me from the undergrowth. The sun did not dim, but something in me did. A filament snapping inside a bulb. This was no ancient indigenous burial site. The material spoke a younger dialect. Modern shoes, cheap belts with corroded buckles, the occasional tooth filling, catching the light. The ground had been patient. The ground had made them anonymous. I abandoned the forest's center and retreated by memory to the ATV, as if the map could be a shield. I left that place as quickly but carefully as I could, moving my feet with the courtesy I hadn't known to extend earlier. Back at the station in Puerto Esperanza, I told our chief. His face learned what mine had learned. There is a silence that is not disbelief, but aw's older brother. He insisted on seeing. And we went. Two bureaucrats with a lantern in their throats. He walked the same slow circle I had walked, and when he finally faced me, his lips moved without sound. We bowed our heads and said what prayers we could remember. It didn't help the dead. It taught the living how to stand. That night, I did not sleep. The ground had looked back. What followed was a choreography I had seen before in lesser tragedies. Vehicles crowding the plain's edge, men in uniforms dusted with pollen, plastic flags blooming where bones crept toward daylight. After that, it was out of our hands as the federal police stepped in to carry out their investigation. They are Argentina's equivalent of the FBI, and in coordination with our group from the National Parks Administration, they were able to paint a picture of what had happened to the many lost souls that we found. To investigate a forest is to interrogate time. They began to ask the trees what they had heard. The answer had been in our history all along. From around 10 years in the 70s and 80s, the Argentine government collaborated with several other South American countries for what was called Operation Condor. The phrase sounds clean. A raptor's glide across a mountain's shoulder. It was not clean. Condor was the code name given to the tactics of anti-communist repression that these countries employed. Files were opened. Old names, once whispered, rattled on the desks of men too young to have made them, along with jailing activists and assassinating politicians. The Argentine security services began what came to be known as Los de la Muerta, the death flights. An airplane makes a perfect accomplice. It leaves no footprints, only a sound that fades into itself. They would load a dozen prisoners onto an airplane or helicopter, fly them out into the middle of nowhere, and then throw them out of the aircraft to disappear them. Sky as executioner, horizon as eraser. Thousands of people were murdered this way, and to this day, many of their bodies have never been recovered. We had not stumbled upon a crime scene. We had stepped into a confession that the plane had been making for years in a language none of us wanted to learn. The forensic teams worked with the patience of rain. Insects were consulted, soil horizons examined like rings in a tree. The dead had a way of returning instructions to us. Here is how you identify me. Here is the shape of my story. Here is the date the world ended, and the date the world began again, because someone finally looked. Some remains were matched, bags were sealed. Phones rang far away, and a mother who had learned to live by not hoping was forced to decide whether to hope again, as much as I am proud to have helped return many lost souls to their rightful resting places. There are still many more who remain missing. This is the arithmetic of terror. Addition by subtraction. Families minus a son, a daughter, a friend, a country minus a version of itself that might have been kinder. Although I am happy to have helped reunite these poor people with their long, grieving families, I'm haunted by the sight of what became of them. The plane kept their bodies and gave us back a duty. People sometimes ask why they were brought to the Chaco. There were nearer rivers, vaster oceans. The answer is partly practical. In a place this large, absence looks like nature. But the deeper reason is that the sky needed a mirror, and the plane offered itself. When a body falls far enough, it becomes weather. The men who arranged those flights believed that erasure is a kind of mercy, at least for themselves. They forgot what every ranger learns in his first storm. Nothing disappears. It merely waits for you to come back with better eyes. In the months that followed, I returned to the stand of algarobo and trumpet trees, not as a surveyor, but as a witness. I mapped not distances, but the slow work of return. How grass bowed away from a newly marked grave. How a widow's hand trembled as she pressed a photograph to the lip of a pit. How the soil, once lifted, exhaled smells that belonged to winter kitchens and lost uniforms. The forest learned our names because we were brave enough to say the names of those we had tried to forget. My colleagues changed too. Men who had spent careers arguing about boundaries and budgets began to tell stories in the present tense. One confessed that he had refused to look at the maps from that era for a decade. Now he traced the flight lines in pencil, as if pulling thread through torn cloth. Another admitted that the prayer he had said with me that first day was the first prayer he'd said since childhood. A place this wide does not make faith easy. It makes it necessary. As for me, I developed a new superstition. Before stepping off a trail, I would say the word permission under my breath. It was not addressed to the trees. It was for those we had failed. The place was a cemetery without graves, and we were the caretakers appointed too late. One evening, close to dusk, I lingered in the clearing where I had first fallen. Light pooled in the hollows, as if the day were collecting itself for the journey west. A pair of Seriemas stalked the grass, dignified and comic. Far off, a generator muttered at the edge of camp. I remembered the exact moment of impact, the way my hands went out, the refusal of the ground to act as ground. Something broke my fall, something hard, but kind of brittle. I stood there and let the memory finish falling through me. When I finally turned away, the sky was a deeper color than I knew how to name. There are two kinds of distances. the miles you travel, and the time you carry. The second kind lengthens on its own. Some nights I dream that I too am being thrown to my death from the hold of an airplane. In the dream, there is no sound, only the certainty of having already left. I am not brave in those dreams. I am a man who has misplaced the ground. When I wake, my hands ache as if from grasping at air. I continued my work, but the work had learned me in return. When I looked at a stand of trees, I did not only see species and canopy and understory, I saw the way history can be folded into shade. I gave talks to students. I stood behind podiums that wobbled and told rooms full of polite faces that maps are promises, and that a broken promise is a kind of weather system. Afterwards, a young man would come up and say his grandmother had stopped speaking the year his uncle vanished. Another would ask whether the forest forgives. I told them forgiveness was a human verb, and the forest was busy with nouns: root, loam, bone, rain. Gran Choco is a very wild place, but wildness is not the same as lawlessness. The first is a character, the second is a choice. I wrote this down for myself so that I would not begin to think that the plane had been to blame. The plane had done what planes do, received what fell. The rest belonged to men, and to the machinery of men, and to the silences they cultivated. I grew angrier as I grew older, which is the reverse of what wisdom is supposed to look like. I am not sorry about this. On the anniversary of the discovery, I have never decided whether to call it discovery or encounter. I returned alone. I carried flowers I had no right to carry, and placed them where the first skull had stared past me. I crossed myself before brushing myself off from a kneel that became a kind of inventory of what I had given the plane, of what it had taken, of what it had shown me, because I finally asked. A wind rose, unremarkable as any other wind. The petals trembled against the bone white of a flagged marker. I told the air that we were not done. I told the air that the dead had not been obedient, after all. If you ask what haunts me, it is not the bones. Bones are honest. They say, this is what remains when a person refuses to be reduced to nothing. What haunts me is the arithmetic I could not complete, the faces I will never be able to name, the letters that arrive at no address. I've seen the heartbreaking effects of men's greed with my own 2 eyes, but I've also seen far, far worse things in the forest of Gran Chaco. The first kind of damage impoverishes a land. The second tries to impoverish memory itself. The second failed. I keep the notebook from that day in a drawer, a relic of war and weather. The page with the clearing's coordinates is stained with the same dust I carried home on my cuffs. Sometimes I open it and lay a fingertip against the pencil marks. as if pressure could become a blessing. In the margins, I have copied sentences that I am not sure I wrote. The earth remembers the shape of a falling body. The sky is a ledger, and every debt comes due. Silence is not the absence of voices. It is the presence of fear. I read these and think of how language tries to catch what has already fallen past it. Once, speaking to a group of families, I made a promise I had no authority to make, that the plane would give back more names. It has, slowly, in the stubborn way of places that endure. I am proud to have helped return many lost souls to their rightful resting places, though pride is a poor word in this company. Better to say that I was allowed to carry a corner of a burden that belongs to all of us. Better to say that I was taught how to listen when the ground speaks. I will end where I began, with a confession. I went to the forest to count trees. I believed that resilience was a property of ecosystems, a function of rainfall and species diversity. A set of numbers in a report I would file and forget. I was wrong. Resilience is also a choice made by the living in the presence of the dead. It is the decision to name what was done and by whom. It is the refusal to let the horizon be an excuse. The plane does not swallow names. It keeps them for us until we are ready to hear. And so, on certain nights when the darkness feels like altitude, I step outside and face the unmarked miles. I lift my chin and breathe carefully, as if I were already falling. Then I do what any ranger does when lost. I look for what does not move, the line of trees against a paler sky, the habit of stars to persist. I speak aloud, quietly, the names I know, and leave space for the names I don't. The wind, faithful and without malice, carries them nowhere and everywhere at once. The plane listens. I listen back. Story number 2. This desert keeps secrets, and I've carried one of them in my left ear ever since the day a stranger didn't shoot me. There are places where silence is so complete it becomes pressure, a hand on the back of your neck, guiding you toward choices you'll think about for the rest of your life. I went into the wilderness to map the earth and came out mapped by it instead. If you want to know what a conscience sounds like, stand alone under an Arizona sky and wait for footsteps that aren't yours. By the time the trail loops back to your truck, you'll have decided what you can live with and what you can't. I used to be a surveyor for a large oil and gas company, a nameless badge that opened gates and closed conversations. I sold it to myself as stewardship. I'd find the least harmful way to take what we'd already decided to take. The work gave me sunrises that smelled like iron and creosote, and a ledger that didn't balance when I tried to sleep. I told myself compromise is still a kind of love for the world, just a quieter one. That day, the sky was a hard blue plate, and the hills looked like they'd been pressed from rust. I'd driven washboard roads until my teeth clicked together, and then walked, each step sinking a fraction, the sand holding on like a forgotten promise. When the geophones were in and humming beneath their small hoods, I should have felt the calm I always felt when the job turned into data. Instead, the morning had the edge of a sentence that doesn't know how it's supposed to end. I parked myself on a flat rock and sipped warm water I'd pretended would still be cold by late afternoon. That's when he appeared. Long hair, sun-thinned shirt, a smile like a trail sign that had been shot at and still did its job. He waved the way strangers do when the wilderness makes you gentler, took the opposite rock without asking, as if the desert had set a table for us. We talked trails and heat and the right way to read clouds. The conversation drifted like dust. Then he asked what I did out there with the little metal hats and all the notes. I could have said ranger or researcher or any euphemism a throat can invent to keep the peace. Instead, I told the truth, because the truth was a habit I wore, like a frayed cap. No, I wasn't a ranger. I was an oil and gas surveyor. He nodded, like he approved of honesty, or maybe like he was proud I'd saved him the trouble of guessing. He let me explain the responsible part, the regenerative part, the fewer holes in the earth if we know where to drill part. I said the lines I said to myself, to friends, to anyone who asked, and to the many who didn't. He listened like he was letting me finish a prayer before he told me the roof had already caved in when the wind shifted. His expression didn't. I got a question about that whole surveying thing. He took his time, like the question belonged to the land and not to either of us. I can't help but wonder, how the F do you sleep at night? The friendliness in his voice made the words hit harder, the way a pat on the shoulder can hide a knife. I tried to keep my tone level as a topographic map, said I slept fine because I worked for energy, not weapons, because I believed math could be mercy, because waste and guesswork were the real villains. He tilted his head, smiled the way you smile at a child who thinks shadows can be counted, and offered a game show cadence, the desert's own, "I'll take bull crap for 200, Alex." We tried to pivot, but sometimes a conversation is a trail cut into a hillside. Once you're on it, there's only one direction that isn't falling. I told him we should change the subject or part ways. He kept smiling and pressed his finger gently into the bruise he'd made. When I stood, he stood. When I turned away from my truck on purpose, he matched my pace with casual cruelty, tossing little questions that were really verdicts. How does a person live with himself? When did a map become a confession? I gave him one clear chance to leave me alone. He raised his hands, stepping back into the role of reasonable man. All right, man, you got it. I can see I got under your skin a little, but I'll be on my way." He walked out of sight down the trail, and the desert closed behind him like water. I waited long enough for heat to pool in the hollows of the rocks. My pulse stopped broadcasting in my throat. Then I turned toward the truck, grateful for the simple arithmetic of steps and distance. I had put half a mile between the place I'd rested and the place I wanted to be when the quiet broke like a bad idea. "Hey, scumbag!" He came out of the scrub like the answer to a question I hadn't asked. Arm extended, metal in his hand, catching the sun. The world shrank to the circle at the end of the barrel. I lifted my hands, the universal sign for not so tough now. "Huh?" He didn't need to say it. He did anyway. "Not so tough now, huh?" He told me to get on my knees, and I tasted dust. I thought of my mother's kitchen clock that always ran a minute slow. The dumb mercy of believing you have more time than you do. I decided I wouldn't kneel. Not because I was brave, but because something in me broke in favor of staying a person for the little bit I thought I had left. Words wouldn't come. The tongue is an animal that hides when it smells fear. He pressed the gun to my head and gave me the speech, how my work was a weapon held to the planet, how he'd sleep better if he made sure I never slept again. The desert listened because deserts are patient witnesses. There is a moment when you think the story is over, and it's not courage that keeps you upright. It's habit. There is a moment when the body becomes paperwork, waiting to be filed by someone in a uniform who will say, "I'm sorry," as if those words can bend time. There is a moment when you understand that a stranger's righteousness is the most dangerous weather you'll ever stand in. He kept talking. I kept shaking. The barrel was a punctuation mark at the end of a life that suddenly felt like a paragraph. He asked me again how I was able to live with myself, and I had no good answer. Just a stack of explanations that felt like postcards from a place that was already underwater. Then he made his choice. The gun twitched, the sun flashed off the sight, and he moved the gun to the side at the last second. The shot tore the silence and my left ear with it. Pain filled my head like water through a broken window. I stumbled, hands to the hot side of my face. Air suddenly the wrong temperature. His last mercy was not to finish the job. His last words were the world's smallest sermon. "Quit your job, asshole." I didn't see him go. I saw specks and light and the memory of my mother opening a window because the house smelled like rain. I thought I was dying because blood came warm into my palm, and it's hard to think in straight lines when the world is tilting. The desert held me until I could stand. The truck never looked more like a companion animal than it did that afternoon. Hospitals are strange after the wilderness. The lights insist. The voices ask and ask and ask. The forms want squares filled with things you barely remember. I told the same story to a nurse, and then to a deputy with kind eyes, and then to another deputy who had the kind of eyes you get when you've heard too many stories. They wrote it down, said they'd look, said they were sorry. About my ear, about the man, about how big the world is, and how small the odds of finding one particular ghost. Healing is noisy when you can't hear half of it. The ringing set up shop and refused to pay rent. In the mornings, I tested myself, covering my right ear, asking the left to tell me the day's weather. It always said storm. Friends told me to take time off. Coworkers told me I was brave, which was untrue. Strangers on the internet told me everything is political if it makes someone angry, and nothing is political if it makes them money. My mother told me she loved me, which was the only sentence that didn't require argument. When I went back out, the land felt less like a partner and more like a witness who'd been called to the stand too many times. Every thorn had a point to make. Every coyote track read like a warning. I pretended not to understand. At night, I pictured the man's easy smile and tried to rearrange his face into something that made sense. A person from a town I'd passed, a name I could give the deputies, a reason that would let me put the gun and the sun into the same memory without shaking. Work lost its story. I had told myself a good one about harm reduction. I still believed parts of it, but belief couldn't compete with a hot circle of metal pressed against my skull, and the thought that a stranger had decided my job put me beyond bargaining. I filed the paperwork to transfer to a desk. When that didn't help, I filed the paperwork to leave. I wish I could say I left on a tide of clarity, that I packed my boxes with the solemnity of a man ending a long argument with himself. The truth is less poetic. I woke up on a Tuesday. Couldn't stand the idea of parking on a dirt shoulder or asking permission to cross a locked gate that led to a piece of earth we would measure and consider and maybe cut. I emailed my resignation because resignation is just a different kind of measurement, the line you won't cross again. I found work that paid less and made better sleep. It didn't require I defend myself at potlucks. No one asked me how the F do you sleep at night anymore. The left ear stayed stubborn. On some evenings, the ringing softened into something like surf, and I let myself imagine I'd retired to an ocean I couldn't afford. On others, it swelled until I understood why noise is used to break people. You don't get closure when a man walks out of a desert with your hearing and no name. You get habits. You check mirrors. You double back on trails like a skittish animal. You start wearing a hat that has nothing to do with your old job, but still feels like protection. You don't lie about what you used to do, but you don't volunteer it either. You learn the exact distance between honesty and self-preservation on a map no one else will ever read. Sometimes I drive the old roads. The ruts are different, but the land hasn't moved. I park and walk until the truck is a dot. I don't put geophones in the ground. I put my palm on the dirt and pretend I can hear something beneath the ring, some slow conversation the planet is having with itself, some more patient math than the kind I used to make. The desert doesn't answer. It never did. It just waits you out once, on a day too much like the other day. I saw a figure in the distance, long hair, the same careless stride. My chest locked, then unlocked. I almost called out. Instead, I sat down where I was and counted my breaths as if they were miles back to a hospital I no longer needed. The figure drifted away on a path I couldn't see. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just the shape that question makes when it walks on two legs. If you're waiting for me to say I forgave him, you'll be waiting with the dessert. I don't possess that tool. I have others. Tenderness for small things, patience for a kettle to sing, stubborn loyalty to people who answer their phones in the middle of the night. I have a useless catalog of cloud names and a habit of checking where imaginary trailheads might be. I have a scar of sound that sometimes acts like thunder and sometimes like a warning bell. What I don't have is the belief that we ever settle the bill we write in places like this. I sleep most nights, not because I deserve to, not because I found the correct politics, not because I took the right job after the wrong one. I sleep because the body insists. Because my mother's clock still runs a minute slow, and when I visit, we sit in her kitchen and talk as if the world didn't turn while I was gone. Because I can put a hand to my left ear and tell myself the ocean is inside me. And sometimes that's not a lie. There's a fantasy I come back to when the ringing is its worst. In it, I see him again. Not in a courtroom, not in a headline, but on some neutral trail the way we met. Two people inheriting the same light. He asks the question. Only this time, I answer with something that isn't a defense or a grievance. I say, I sleep badly, and then I sleep better. I sleep knowing I cause harm and trying to cause less. I sleep because the alternative is to stand upright all night until morning makes a statue out of me. He doesn't nod. He doesn't smile. He disappears again into the scrub because ghosts have places to be. And I walk back to my truck with both hands free. When I turn the key, the engine wakes the birds, and everything I used to measure becomes unmeasurable. The desert shrugs. The sky brightens. I drive the washboards slow so the truck doesn't shake apart. The road gives me back to the highway. The highway gives me back to town. In my pocket, the ringing keeps time. In my head, the question still walks. How do you sleep at night? I roll down the window and let the wind answer for me without words. Story number 3. I thought freedom would feel like altitude, like the blue lifting weight off my ribs. I was wrong. Freedom began with the first honest thing I told myself. It started the day I stepped off a gleaming life that photographed better than it lived. And it found me again, miles above a mute forest, when I saw something I still can't account for. What I'm about to tell you is why I don't sleep when the wind slants north. After earning my pilot's license, I managed to land myself a pretty cushy job flying for a major airline. The pay was fantastic. The hours weren't too bad, and my girlfriend thought that I looked great in my fitted uniform and aviator shades. People thought I was having the time of my life. But the truth was, I hated it. I hated the structure, how polished, but ultimately phony everything about the airline was. And I hated paying a ton of money to rent a home I barely visited. So, one day, I just shocked everyone by just quitting. I didn't just quit with nothing lined up. It's just that the new job happened to involve moving up to Alaska to be a bush pilot. There's a kind of honesty the cold demands. In the city, I could fake it, smile through turbulence made of meetings and uniforms and hotel shampoo. Up here lies Fabo the goggles. The first time I walked the gravel at the little airfield that would be mine, I knew I had traded polish for consequence, and for once the bargain felt fair. My girlfriend thought I was crazy, and we broke up not long after a big fight. We threw words like dishes and watched them shatter. When the echo drained away, I packed the life I had worn smooth and gave the excess to strangers. And then, about a month later, and after selling off or giving away like half of the stuff I owned, I flew up to Alaska and out to the little airfield that I'd be working from. The runway looked like a seam torn into green cloth. The office radio coughed in an aging accent. Men and women came through in boots that spoke mud the way suit leather speaks lobbies. I stayed in a cabin just a short walk from the airfield. A place so run down when I moved in that first night. It had me wondering if I'd actually made a mistake. The windows chattered in their frames, even without wind. The stove sulked before catching. Mice had an established union and an unapologetic schedule. Still, the silence was the first one in years that didn't feel like judgment. It felt like a pause long enough to put a life into. But then after a trip over to the Fairbanks to pick up some groceries and home improvements, the cabin started to feel a little more like home. And I remembered why the whole thing seemed like a good idea in the first place. It was peaceful. I got to set my own schedule, and some of my passengers ended up being some incredibly interesting people. There was something about living wild that felt good for my soul, too. But don't worry, I'm not about to get all poetic on you. The truth is simpler. I traded plastic brightness for sky you could taste. I learned the sound of distance, the way it sits on snow. I learned that strangers here treat your name like a tool. They use it when needed and set it down clean. Life was good. But that didn't mean that there wasn't a little turbulence here and there. I had trouble in the air on more than one occasion. I had encounters with wildlife that looked at me like I was dinner, and I saw one or two things from the air that I'd never be able to fully explain. And this is the story of just one of them. The day began with a sky that had been ironed flat. 2 researchers in the back, polite to the point of evaporation. We talked weather and flight time, and the way thaw comes in grudges. I climbed to a ribbon of air that tugged steady at the prop and settled in to let the world unscroll. One day, I was making a pretty routine flight, taxiing a couple of researchers from A to B. I'd been in the air for a couple of hours already, flying under superb weather conditions for the spring, when something down below suddenly caught my eye. It wasn't a flash. It was a rhythm. The forest here is written in chaos. The eye learns to trust that. Something in the weave had been combed. The ground beneath was a carpet of trees. But every so often, there'd be a little clearing, some large, some smaller, frozen scars where snow lingers longest. Save for the occasional rogue tree, most were completely bare, but the one I spotted that morning had a row of what looked like saplings, all standing in a row. A line. It struck me as an odd sight among all that wilderness. Nature doesn't favor rulers and right angles. Straight lines advertise intention, but as I got closer and ended up passing the clearing with it on my left, I looked out the window and saw they weren't saplings, but crosses. Cold slid into me in a clean blade. I bank left, turning so I could pass the clearing a second time at a lower altitude. You don't see a lot of stuff like that out in the middle of nowhere. So I guess curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to check it out. Coming up on the clearing again, I could see that they were crosses. All right, big ones, too. But it was only when I flew directly over that I saw something squirming against the wood, something that was almost camouflaged from a distance, and I could only see up close. Movement where there should have been none. The scale was wrong, too still around it, too alive within. There were people attached to those crosses, some still, some writhing around in what I could only imagine was absolute agony. My hands stayed competent, My mind ran for the tree line. I climbed a breath and let the clearing slide behind me like a door closing on heat. I didn't take another pass. I got myself back on course and hit my radio to see if anyone was within range. The only person I could raise was a logging camp, but I asked them to get in touch with the WSOR, the Wilderness Search and Rescue, on my behalf. My voice sounded borrowed. When the guy asked what he should say, I couldn't bring myself to tell him exactly what I'd seen. I knew he'd think I was crazy, so I made something up about spotting some campers who looked like they were in trouble. I know the difference between a report and a confession. I gave him the former. The guy at the logging camp said he'd get on the horn to search and rescue. And then, after I thanked them, I left to make the rest of the flight with nothing but my thoughts and theories to keep me company. Shame arrived with grim punctuality. Shame for not circling again, for wanting badly to be elsewhere. I didn't mention anything to the researchers, and their company was actually a huge relief, as it kept my mind off what I just seen. We talked data sets and freeze updates. My mouth worked. My eyes kept seeing wood and skin, but on that last leg of the flight, when I was all on my own again, I started thinking all that solitude and isolation might be getting the best of me. The brain will abrade a memory until it fits the pocket. I didn't trust my eyes. I didn't trust the part of me that needed them to be wrong. I radioed my boss on the long-range radio that I had in my cabin, and I told him about what I'd seen. Or rather, what I thought I might have seen out there in the wilderness. He told me to fly back to Fairbanks, to take a week off. I parked the bird, walked the path to the cabin like a waiter balancing soup, and packed a bag without looking at what my hands chose. And when I did, we met up for some dinner at a little steak and taters place that he liked. And he said the human contact would do me some good. He wasn't wrong. Words sound different when someone else holds the other end of them, over plates that steamed the windows. He watched me unspool the day. He listened like mechanics do, half on the story, half on the sound it made. But he also told me something I never forgot. He said he found it funny how some people think of Florida as the weirdest state in the Union. And maybe out of the lower 48, it is. But of all the places he'd ever lived, it was the state of Alaska that took the cake for sheer weirdness. He said it as a man who had seen too much and chosen to keep flying anyway. It wasn't just all the people that had gone missing over the years, either. It was the people who hadn't, which made the wilderness such an odd place. People who moved up there to get away from things. People just like me, I guess. I laughed without humor. He lifted his glass to the joke of it, and for the most part, all they wanted was to be left alone so they could live how they wanted to. That line rattled around in me like a bead in a tin. Wanting to be left alone is not a crime, but it can be a curtain. The week off honed me rather than softened me. I cleaned tools already clean. I fixed things that didn't need fixing. When I closed my eyes, I counted, not sheep, but shapes. Uprights, cross beams, silhouettes. The cold creaked in the eaves and refused to narrate. On the third morning, I filed a supply run that curved near the coordinates I had penciled on a topo. A clean little lie told to no one in particular. The air was flyable, thin sheets of cloud like unmade beds, wind gentle as a held breath. I lifted off alone, the cabin shrinking to a dot, then a rumor, then a memory. The valley presented itself, rehearsed and indifferent. The place arrived not with drama, but with familiarity, which felt worse. The clearing looked smaller now. Absence had settled over it, like snow slicked flat by a gloved palm. No crosses, no figures. The ground held a grammar of disturbance, post holes where weight had stood. 2 tree trunks with bark polished to a darker sheen, an ash circle faint as a bruise. The absence shouted. Dropping in on skis would have been easy. Fear is not always cowardice. Sometimes it's the only part of you committed to your continued narration. I circled high, shot overlapping frames with a long lens, and turned toward coffee that wouldn't taste right. At the strip, I found Colette, a ranger with a smile like a blade kept responsibly sharp. She mapped both the world as printed and the world that slips the edges of maps. I showed her the photos. She looked until looking had no more to give. Had I told anyone else? Yes, my boss, a logging camp. She nodded the way you nod at expected weather. We took a helicopter the next day, slow over the spine of the hills. The pilot and Colette spoke coordinates in a language of numbers and certainty. The clearing received us with the cautious silence of a dog pretending to sleep. The skids set down on crust hard enough to protest and then accept the weight. Up close, the place lectured in geometry. Post holes, rope bites scarring 2 trunks, a smudged ash ring that asked for knees and patience to see. Colette paced it like a clock and never said ritual, never said crime. Photograph everything was as far as she would let the words go. We did. The camera made domestic sounds in a place that was not a home. No bodies, no clothing, no blessed clue. The snow kept its secrets the way the sea keeps ships, as a practice, not as a kindness. We logged coordinates, wrote a report that would be filed into a tidy digital drawer labeled something like inconclusive, the tidy word we give to untidy truths. Back at the cabin that night, I could not persuade my hands to be still. I polished the same pan to a shine it had no right to. I sharpened a knife past utility into ideology. The forest breathed like a sleeping animal, and I stood just outside its dream, measuring my size against its hunger. A fox crossed the tree line and assessed me with arithmetic only it knew how to solve. Days recommenced their business. I flew. People climbed in with coolers, with maps, with hopes. The work remained familiar. I did not. Strange new categories bloomed in my head. Where I had once filed certain sites under curious or explainable, I began filing them under take the longer way. A path cut sharply through alder where no path should be. A glint that acted like glass sitting where bottles don't live. A rectangle of shadow too square to be shade. I trained myself not to pretend I hadn't seen what I had seen. That was the real cost of staying. Like I said, I saw a whole bunch of other weird stuff during flights, but nothing that ever stuck with me as long as those crosses did. I hope it was part of some passion play type of thing, and those people were just up there on their own free will and live to tell the tale. Because the alternative, thinking they were put up there to die. It's almost too horrible to even think about. Spring broke the river's skin. The world turned to thawed metal and mud. Colette sent a relay. A hiker had wandered out of that region, wrists printed with old abrasions. He declined medical help with a smile that didn't use his eyes, declined a ride with a politeness that was neither performative nor negotiable, and offered no name. The message ended there, clean as a clipped wire. I lined up a dozen stories that fit those small facts, and then turned them face down, like cards that refused to be read. I overflew the clearing one last time before breakup took the tracks and softened them into forgetfulness. The post holes had collapsed into shallow dimples. The ash ring no longer argued for its outline. The forest was doing its old work, absorbing narrative until only root remained. I slowed and said something I hadn't known I needed to hear, not to the trees or to the ghost of what had stood there, but to the part of me that had piloted into this place on purpose. Keep your eyes open. Don't pretend you didn't see it. Live in the place you chose. Honestly, and for the most part, all they wanted was to be left alone so they could live how they wanted to. If there's a moral here, it has no appetite for capital letters. The wilderness isn't empty. It is industrious with lives that owe us nothing. Out there, you are not the protagonist. You are a permitted visitor with a lease signed in weather. Fly long enough, and the place will trim your soul down to something more exact, more responsible with the truths it carries. I still fly. I still pack a camera and a spare pair of gloves, a coil of line, a habit of leaving room in the tank for detours, and in my head for the possibility that what I believe about the world might be mistaken by a few necessary degrees. I check weather like a farmer checks sky, suspicious of forecasts issued by distant mouths. I measure days in airframes and oil temps, in how often the wind lets me think without interrupting. On clear nights, the aurora walks the ridge like a quiet procession. I sit on the steps with something hot in a cup and try to name shades of green, as if taxonomy could soothe. The river below changes its mind the way all honest things do, slowly, for reasons that don't require my understanding. I don't have answers. I have the hum of a heater, ice shifting its weight out on the flats, a stack of maps gone soft at the corners, and a sky that keeps its counsel. It's enough. It must be, sometimes, descending toward the strip. I see the ghost of that line as if it had been drawn lightly in pencil across the canopy. It's never really there. The mind is a patient forger. But the angle of my turn changes a breath, and I line up for final with a respect I didn't own before. I carry the weight of that day in the same way I carry fuel, calculated, distributed, acknowledged. If fear is in the cabin with me, I let it buckle in rather than pretend it hasn't bought a ticket. There are places on the map I don't visit now unless paid in necessity. There are questions I radio in before they become emergencies. And there is a promise I keep, small and utilitarian. When I see something that looks like a straight line where none should be, I do not tell myself it's my imagination just because it would be kinder to believe it. I give it the courtesy of attention, and the place gives me back exactly what it owes me. Nothing more, nothing less. If you came north for answers, I can't sell you any. What I can offer is the most I got. A record kept dutifully, coordinates logged, photographs stored, a voice that will not dress the day in myth to save you from its edges. I once believed freedom was altitude. Now I think it's simply the decision to live with what you've seen. The sky permits both kinds. The ground remembers the difference. And if somewhere, in some clearing I won't find again, there were people who chose a pain I cannot explain for reasons I am not invited to understand, then I hope they walked away and fed themselves and warmed their hands afterward and called it whatever they meant to call it. Because the other version is a door I will not open from the inside of my own head. I refuse to furnish it. I refuse to light it. I will not let it become a room. So I keep flying. I keep telling the truth small enough to carry. Once, from an airplane, I saw a line that had no business being a line. And when I came back, the line was gone. But the place where it had been would not forget me. That's it. That's all. That's the whole inventory. The rest is weather and decisions and a map that ends where the world decides to become itself again, without witnesses. Story number 4. 5 of us set out to prove something simple and stupid. That fear is a campfire you can walk through if you keep your eyes on the glow. I learned the hard way that some fires are painted white and wait among the trees. I still hear the river in my dreams. A cold rope dragging at my ankles, promising that if I follow, it will give back what it took. There's a backpack I see sometimes when I close my eyes, dangling, gutted, stitched with black shafts, and every time I blink, it swings closer. Friends will tell you they've got your back. The woods will show you who means it by asking for a toll. Before that week, I believed being armed meant being safe. After that week, I believed in distance, daylight, and never turning your face to the dark for too long. I'm the kind of person who falls in love with an idea and chases it until it turns around. That year, the idea was a game show, and the lie it sold me. I was flipping channels and landed on Alone, the one where people vanish into the Canadian wild and try to outlast one another for money and pride. Sitting there with my buddies, I said something dumb about how I'd do fine, how hunger and cold were just math problems, how luck could be bullied. Trash talk is easy in a warm room. It's easier with beer. The plan took root fast. We picked the biggest, meanest wilderness we could drive to and gave it a hard name so we'd feel brave saying it out loud. The River of No Return. The map stitched that title to the land like a warning label, and we peeled it off with our bare hands. On paper, the place is the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. On our tongues, it was just River of No Return. 5 of us left Boise, pointed a truck through North Fork, and shouldered our lives at a trailhead that led toward Long Tom Mountain and the glossy bend of the Salmon River. We told ourselves it would be 4 days out and back. 1 day to breathe and swim and pretend we were the kind of men who get calmer the farther they get from pavement. Day 1 chewed us up. Day 2 spit us onto a ridge so wide with sky it made our problems into dots. We dropped packs, stashed towels, and scrambled for water, bright enough to sting. Dave brought a collapsible rod and pulled a couple from the current. Not big, but ours. Fire does a specific thing to fresh fish, turns it into the answer to a question you forgot you asked. We climbed back to camp while the evening cooled the edges of rock, ready to build a blaze, salt the meat, and toast the dumb luck of being out there together. That was when Kyle crawled into his tent, then stepped back out wearing a frown that started between his eyes and kept traveling. "Which one of you thinks this is clever?" he asked. No one answered because no one knew. Then he said it flat. His backpack was gone. We laughed at first. Habit, not humor. Then stopped when the tent was turned inside out and the pockets were empty. We walked the perimeter as if we could press a rewind button into the dirt. The truth arrived quietly and sat down by our gear, like it had always belonged. Somebody had been here while we weren't. Somebody watched us play in the river and took their pick. Jay went hard in the direction of anger, volunteering a hunt like it was a chore he knew how to finish. I told him no. Shared told him no. Dave told him no. Kyle said yes with his whole body. We argued our way into the kind of silence that means friendship is bruised, but not yet bleeding. In the end, Kyle and Jay stormed off with flashlights and pride. They came back with nothing but steps and sweat. The night tasted like metal. The following morning was supposed to be rest day. Instead, we posted ourselves in shifts because Dave, who grew up with rivers braided around his childhood, said the quiet was wrong and the eyes were out there. We gathered wood until our backs protested, fed the fire until it felt like throwing pebbles at a tide, and checked our pistols like the weight might make a promise. That kind of vigilance is a glue that stiffens all the wrong places. I remember thinking we were turning into statues with triggers. By late afternoon on the third day, we'd convinced ourselves the theft was the whole story. We were tired of being vigilant statues, tired of peering into brush that didn't blink back. That's when Shared walked off for privacy, gun on his hip and caution in his stride. He was gone 2 minutes, maybe 3, before we heard him bark a curse. He met us halfway, breath chopped short, skin showing the kind of fear that steals color. He said a figure stood a football field away, far enough to doubt and close enough to mark. The face was wrong in a way that didn't need words. White, flat, bright as chalk, a mask or makeup. Either way, a decision. You can feel a group shrink and harden at the same time. Kyle didn't sprint toward the trees like I expected. The word painted did something to him. It did something to me too. We weren't dealing with a random scavenger anymore. This was theater. It meant intention. It meant patience. It meant we were an audience and someone had arranged the scene. We packed as the sun slid down and decided on movement over defense. No more flame signaling our position. No more waiting to be stared at. We would walk under night and sleep in the truck. We told ourselves that plan sounded brave. What it really sounded like was retreat spoken through teeth. Dark came in a single breath. We locked into a rhythm. 70 steps. Check 6. 70 steps. Sweep the trees. 70 steps. Listen. The trail coiled through black timber, and our beams sketched fragile tunnels where certainty could survive a few seconds at a time. I kept imagining my light catching a chalk-bright mask between the trunks. My palms itched. My jaw hummed. No one said much because words felt like dropped plates in a quiet house. It was Jay who pointed first. "There," he said, voice narrow as a wire, and our lights converged. From a low branch hung Kyle's backpack, the shoulder straps cut short so it looked like something had been beheaded and tied for display. Fletched shafts pinned the fabric in a brutal constellation. Arrows hum when they were thrown. These were mute as nails. We stood under that hanging exhibit, and, for the first time, I understood we were being curated. Kyle reached to take it down. "Leave it," Jay said, as if the word evidence could grow boots and walk to a sheriff on its own. Shared asked what cops could do with a story assembled out of trees and dark. He wasn't wrong. Whoever shadowed us knew how to be seen for only a second and remembered for hours. We cut the bag free because almost everything in the woods is a choice between bad and worse. And we chose the version where Kyle didn't have to stare at his property nailed to a tree. We moved. The forest moved too. Or maybe that was our minds keeping pace with our fear. Our lights kept finding emptiness where a face should have been. A mile became 3. 3 felt like 10. We kept our discipline until it frayed, then tied it back together with breath and habit. When a clearing opened, we crossed it fast and ugly. When the path narrowed, we became a single file of doubts. At one point, I tasted river air and knew we weren't lost. That felt like mercy. We didn't see the white face again. Maybe he didn't need a second performance. Maybe the show was over. By the time a pale ribbon of road showed through the brush, we were blinking at the idea of metal and glass and ignition, like we'd discovered a new element. We threw packs into Dave's truck and sat there, not looking at each other. The cab smelled like sweat, cedar, and the afterimage of adrenaline. Back in town, Kyle took an arrow to a desk with a badge. Turned out the numbers meant model, not identity. The kind of sporting goods you can buy by the dozen. There was no mystery solved, just the official stamp of "not our problem." We didn't argue. It wasn't a fight we could win with paperwork. Friends asked how the trip went. I told them the truth in a way that still let me sleep. We hiked, we swam, we learned to count to 70, and we left the river of no return with more questions than we brought. What I don't tell them is the feeling that someone had practiced on other groups, that we were a repeat performance refined to a gleam. I don't tell them about the mask in my dreams. I don't tell them how sometimes a sudden quiet on a sidewalk makes my hands look for a flashlight they are not holding. If you go out there, take more than gear. Take humility. Take the understanding that being armed is not the same as being ready. And if you ever see your life hanging from a branch and stitched with arrows, don't wait for the curator to step into the light. Leave while you still know which way the road runs. Leave before the fire asks for a face. Story number 5. I thought Montana would give me a clean horizon and a better version of myself. Instead, it gave me a night I still dream about. A night that moved like a shadow with hooves. I came for the complete cowboy experience and found out what that actually means when the sky has no walls and the dark has a will. We believed the herd would teach us teamwork. It did. It also taught us how quickly a body folds when 1,200 pounds of muscle refuses to stop. The first warning wasn't a whisper or a footstep. It was half a rabbit, hot and red, landing by our fire like a thrown dare. By morning, I could tell which of us carried real fear. Not the ones telling jokes, but the ones who ate without tasting, scanning the grass as if the grass could scan back. I hadn't yet learned the difference between a picture and a place. The brochure had sky that seemed to go on forever. The place had wind that went on longer. So, almost 15 years ago now, before my husband and I settled down and started a family, I went on a horse drive up in Montana. It started as a present to my younger self, the girl who drew mares in the margins of her homework. I booked in the spring of 2009, said yes to a ranch in southern Montana, and stepped out of the Billings airport with a bag that smelled like leather and old dreams. There were other guest riders, jet-lagged in expensive boots, laughing too loud because they were trying on new versions of themselves. Some of them come from as far away as Europe, our shuttle driver said, tapping the speedometer while the planes unrolled. The ranch sat low and wide in the light, with a cook who served dinner the way some people deliver sermons. No nonsense, and you leave feeling different. Our lead guide broke the week into shapes we could hold. A few warm-up rides to learn each other's edges. And then, finally, we'd use the wrangling skills we'd learned to drive a herd of 150 horses south of the border to their summer home in Wyoming. Heaven, I thought, because I hadn't met the price yet. Mornings started early enough to make time a physical thing. We learned the sound a bridle makes when it's lifted with purpose, the way leather changes the air. They paired me with a caramel Mustang named Chip, black mane laid over her neck like an honest confession. Common and disciplined, but full of energy, too. She moved me without asking, and I let her, the way you let a river have your reflection. We rode into the country until fences became suggestions, and then memories. The Montana I thought I knew, the one in the coffee table book, evaporated into the Montana that breathes, sage that keeps its secrets, ridges that tempt and scold, distances that fold the way heat does over asphalt. Toward evening, we brought our horses back at a pace that blurred thoughts into breath. Supper tasted like permission. I slept like a coin under a pillow. The next day, we pointed north. the land flatter, the sky somehow taller. We were hunting the herd we'd been promised. At first, we had nothing but faith and a line on a map. Then the horizon became a living sentence, and every comma in it moved. There they were, bays, chestnuts, palominos, scattered into a page so wide you had to read it with your whole body. They were the descendants of Spanish horses that escaped New Mexico in the 1600s. History doesn't always sit in museums. Sometimes it moves in muscle and dust. The first drive taught us speed and humility. The wranglers didn't decorate their words. They talked to us like they would each other, which meant we learned fast or we learned louder. You can love horses all your life and still be new to this. If you fell out of position, the herd found your absence before you did. I thought I rode well until the wind took my hat and a colt took my lane. I put Chip where the gap was, and her decision became mine. By lunch, I had a second heartbeat. We were warned to sleep early. We had a wake-up call at 4:30 a.m. The next morning, said the boss wrangler, and the next few nights would be spent on bedrolls out in the plains. Excitement is a liar at bedtime. I stared at the dark ceiling, telling myself to sleep like it was a command I could obey. When the alarm cut the room, I poured cowboy coffee like an apology and stacked pancakes like a plan. By the time the horizon unzipped into day, we were moving again. That day, we pushed the herd through a semicircle of country, teaching the edges to obey. Every so often, a colt tried to invent freedom. I went after them, with Chip stretched long, the world narrowing to a line I could hold. When the time came, it felt every bit as good as I thought it would. You don't understand why animals run until you're beside them, feeling the reason. We made camp where the grass said yes. A high line for the horses, our tents in a rough circle. A fire that turned wood into story. We ate the kind of food that makes you grateful for salt. Conversations drifted toward sleep. I stayed up because the sky refused to end, and because stopping felt like admitting something to the dark. One of the wranglers was awake too. We compared brands of jerky as if flavor could explain distance. Then the reason the night was a mouth arrived. Something cut the air above my head and fell short of the fire. Not like gravity's mistake, but like a decision. It was the back half of a jackrabbit torn clean through the middle. The circle broke into standing, into looking, into questions with no handles. One wrangler offered an answer with soft edges. Maybe a bird dropped its meal by accident. But the angle of the throw disagreed. The horses shifted against the line as if the dark had moved closer. The wranglers fanned out and came back empty. And still, the hair on my arms would not lie down. We were told it was probably a prank, that Fort Smith wasn't far, that someone might enjoy scaring tourists. Reassurance is a blanket that covers the knees and leaves the heart cold. Eventually, we slept, or something like it. Morning took us like a draught of water you don't remember reaching for. The mood rode low in the saddle. We didn't chatter. Workplaces, people where they belong. And fear is work too. We crossed a river that looked shallow and wasn't. The herd moved with the humility of creatures who know what they can do. We finished the day 22 miles from where we'd started, our bodies measuring the distance more honestly than any map. At dinner, Jürgen, the German with a laugh that arrived before his sentences, asked a wrangler if we'd find the rabbit's other half. The wrangler laughed. Jürgen laughed with him. Nerves make comedians of us all. Unlikely, but not impossible, someone said, and the words had that flat shape people use when they're hoping to convince themselves. The sun checked out. The wind changed address. We folded into tents as if nylon could bargain with the night. I woke to a sound that had no source, and then too many. Horses on the line, shifting from conversation to argument. The watchman's voice, firm, unafraid, cut the dark. Who's out there? I was unzipping my tent when the herd's noise climbed into something that rearranged my bones. I saw light arcs from flashlights, the camp finding its own eyes. And then the ground remembered how to tremble. They came not in a scatter, but in a choice. Our group of 18 horses come bolting right towards camp. The line had broken. Something had snapped the quiet thread we tied the world with. The nearest wranglers moved to turn them. But timing is a god that doesn't forgive. A stallion shouldered a man to the ground. Two guests reached for each other without meaning to and vanished under a body that did not slow. A tent was a suggestion. A fire was a rumor. We were not obstacles. We were conditions. And conditions can be ignored. The sounds of hurt began to separate from the sounds of fear. Metal clips, which we'd touched 100 times without thinking, became teeth in the dark. Ropes drew lines on skin. That skin would remember. The horses flowed through us like weather, impartial, unstoppable. The only choice left was small and personal. Where to put your hands, what direction to fall, how to make yourself thin in a world suddenly too full. I learned that night how long seconds can be. I learned how much a body can move without language. I learned that fear doesn't make you still. It makes you specific. When the last horse finally cut back into the dark, the camp shifted into what comes after. Groans drew us to them. Headlamps held circles over faces. Someone kept asking what happened as if a different answer might appear. If the question were repeated enough, my tent was torn open, my bag a map of someone else's decisions. We triaged with what we had: bandanas, belts, the kinds of prayers you can say with your mouth closed. Jürgen was on his side, speaking a language his mouth couldn't keep up with. Even in that light, I could see the wrong angles in his ribs, and a few of his teeth had been knocked out. A woman cradled her wrist like a small bird. Another guest blinked as if the dark had gotten inside his head, and he was trying to see it. The wranglers took inventory, even the one who'd been thrown. They moved like men who'd seen this country's temper before. We called for help with a calm that had to be invented. The radio found people we couldn't see. Then the night stretched again, this time waiting for headlights. Out there, miles mean more. Every minute is a road. When the 4x4s finally arrived, they did not announce themselves. They simply became part of our story. Jürgen needed the helicopter, and he got it. The air beating its own path down to us, as if the sky were willing to be useful for once. The rest of us were loaded and counted, our names anchors thrown into a wind that didn't care. Back at the ranch, light felt suspicious. Hospitals took the ones who needed more than gauze and calm voices. I stood without pain and felt guilty for the fact. Survival has its own awkwardness. Relief is heavy when you're carrying it past people who aren't allowed to put theirs down yet. They gave us choices: money back or an invitation to return for free. I took the invitation because stubbornness is part of who I am, and because fear can be a door as well as a wall. But I also kept something quieter and truer: the understanding that paradise is a word people use when they haven't yet met the price the land charges for its beauty. In the days that followed, the ranch became smaller and larger at once. Smaller because the map had shrunk to safety. Larger because the questions had finally shown up. The wranglers told the story the way men who work under sky tell everything, with shrugs, with a soft curse for the unknown, with a respect that doesn't require a name. Maybe a prankster, maybe a predator moving the herd without meaning to. Maybe just fear folding into fear until it overflowed. The rabbit remained the hinge none of us could stop touching in our minds. I cleaned what could be cleaned and wrote notes to people whose names I might never say again. My hands smelled like antiseptic and horse and smoke. Chip stood in the corral with her weight easy on one hip, a question in her ears that I couldn't answer. I touched the place where her mane begins and felt something settle that wasn't peace, but was close enough to use. When I finally slept, my dreams were all geometry, angles of approach, distances to cover, the triangle of firelight, tent, and high line. In each one, the line broke. In each one, I tried to be faster. Waking didn't fix it. Morning simply made it honest again. The land never apologized. The sky kept being itself. Absolute, indifferent, full of room for both mercy and mistake. I rode the last 2 days because I wanted to end facing what had started this. We moved cattle. We checked fences. We did all the small jobs that keep a place from dissolving. The work was ordinary, and it saved me. Ordinary is underrated. It's what the body can hold. On my final evening, I walked past the barn toward the low hill that kept the wind honest. From there, I could see the long cut of the river and the road south, like a thought I hadn't finished having. I told the place, "Thank you," in the only language I had. I stood still and let it look at me. I promised to come back, and I meant it, though I also knew promises made to land are kept on the land's schedule, not ours. Before I left, one of the older wranglers, hat faded, eyes the same color as the river, stood beside me with his hands in his pockets. "You did fine," he said, which was more blessing than compliment. "Out here," he added, "you learn fast or you learn, and that's enough." Then he tipped his head toward the south. "If you do come back for the work, not the story." I nodded because I didn't trust my mouth. On the drive to the airport, the van was quieter than on the way in. Scenery becomes landscape when it's been paid for. Billings arrived like a return to a smaller gravity. At the terminal, we hugged with the brief affection of people who have shared a strange room. My flight took me up through a sky that had watched us fail and carry on. 15 years is a long time to keep a promise to yourself. But some places don't release you. They lend you out. Years later, I still keep the invitation. It sits in a drawer with receipts that no longer matter and a photograph of Chip that always will. I tell myself that when I go back, I'll bring less certainty and more water, that I'll care less about the story and more about the work, that I'll listen with my whole body when the wind changes shape. I also tell myself something harder. It's a wild place, a place some people call home, and some of those people do not like outsiders. Respect isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's the only map that works. When people ask me why I still want to return, I talk about mornings when the breath from 100 animals becomes weather, about how a saddle can remind a spine what it's for, about how distance has a flavor out there. I don't tell them about the rabbit unless they ask, and if they do, I say the truth I have, that there are nights when the world throws something at your feet just to see if you're still interested in walking. I've learned to hold both pictures at once. It was said to be the complete cowboy experience, and to me, it sounded like heaven on earth. And also, but if the beginning was heaven, then the end might as well have been hell. Both statements are true, and neither cancels the other. That's adulthood, I think. That's travel. That's love. If I go back, I'll do it without the need for the place to perform for me. I'll do it with quiet hands and an honest seat, sometimes at night. When the house is still and the clock says I should be asleep, I replay the run. Not the chaos, the moment before it. The soft warning when the high line hummed with question. When Chip lifted her head and found the wind's answer. If I could revise it, I would put a hand out sooner. I would plant someone where the herd could see a different idea. I would turn a body into a gate, but revision is for pages. Life gives you one draft. If you stand long enough in memory, you begin to hear what you couldn't then. I hear the old wrangler's advice bend into a shape I can use for everything else. Come back for the work, not the story. It's become a key I carry into rooms that have nothing to do with horses, marriages, jobs, mornings that arrive with too much weight. When it's heavy, I make a list, mend a fence, check a line. The small jobs save a place. They save a person too. The sky above our neighborhood isn't Montana. It doesn't need to be. But some evenings, the light does a familiar thing, and the trees hold still, as if waiting for a cue. I take a breath that tastes like the first 5 minutes of a ride. And I say, Wyoming, in my head, the way you say a name you haven't used in a while. It still fits in my mouth. And that's how I know I'll go. Not for the brochure, for the work. The invitation promises a drive south of the border to their summer home in Wyoming. I picture the line not as ink, but as a row of moving decisions. If I return, I'll ask for Chip, or her daughter, or a mare with the same unsentimental mercy. I'll pack lighter and reckon sooner. I'll sleep when sleep is offered. I'll tie the high line with a knot that remembers being tested. This time, I'll tell different jokes over dinner, the kind that leave room for the land to answer back. I'll check the edges of camp before the fire is lit. Not because fear is in charge, but because attention is a kind of love we can practice. If something lands near the flames again, I'll study the arc first and the object second. I'll ask the wind what it knows. I'll stand where the herd can see me. And if they run, I'll make myself into a shape that suggests another idea. I don't need redemption from a place that didn't wrong me. I need the practice of being small and useful in a world that's too large to flatter. Out there, you learn what your hands are for: to lift, to steady, to signal, to loosen, to hold, and then let go. You also learn what you can't hold. That lesson doesn't taste sweet, but it feeds you better than victory stories told at bars. When I tell my husband about going back, he asks what I'm looking for. I answer in a language that doesn't translate easily to dinner tables. Room inside my chest that matches the room outside my eyes. Proof that attention is still the sharpest tool I own. A horizon that doesn't have to apologize. He nods. He's seen the invitation. He's seen how I keep it where I can find it in the dark. On the last morning of my first trip, before the airport and the quiet goodbyes, I walked to the corral alone. I stood by the rails and watched the horses breathe. Nothing could stop those horses. No tents, no campfire, not us. Nothing. I don't hold it against them. We were the interruption. They were the weather. If I am ever part of that weather again, I hope to be a front that brings rain where it's needed. If not, I'll settle for being a wind that doesn't make things worse. I keep a small stone from the river on my desk. It is not pretty. It is true. Some days I hold it when the city forgets how to be quiet. Some days I leave it alone so it can do its work without me. A place like Montana doesn't need you to remember it. It knows what it is. But if you do remember, do it properly, with your feet on something that can break your ankle, with your eyes on animals that owe you nothing, with your mind changed by the size of a sky that is not impressed. When I go back, I'll be grateful for what the brochure got right. I'll be grateful for what it omitted. I'll accept the invitation like a contract with the weather. I can bring my best, and the land can bring whatever it wants. If I come home unhurt, that will be luck, not proof of goodness. If I come home marked, I'll tell the truth without asking for applause. I took the second offer, hoping that I'd get to go back one day. That day is not a date yet. It's a line on a map drawn by hooves and wind. I'll find it when I'm ready to be a smaller part of a larger thing again. Until then, I practice in ordinary rooms, tie the day high, check the knots, sleep when the sky allows, wake when the work calls. It's not heaven, it's not hell. It's the price you pay to touch a horizon and have the horizon touch you back.